Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll.
梁歌制作 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll.
Chapter 1. Down the rabbit hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank, and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it.
第一章，在兔子洞里，爱丽丝开始厌倦坐在她姐姐旁边的岸边，以及无事可做。有一两次，她偷看了她姐姐正在读的书，但里面没有图片或对话。
And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid.
书有什么用？爱丽丝想，没有图片或对话，所以她在自己的心里考虑着，以及她可以因为炎热的一天让她感到很困，而且很愚蠢。
Whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that.
制作菊花链的乐趣是否值得费力起身采摘雏菊？突然一只粉红色眼睛的白兔从她身边跑过来，这并没有什么特别了不起的。
Nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, "Oh dear, oh dear, I shall be late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this.
爱丽丝也不认为听到兔子自言自语有什么不妥。亲爱的，亲爱的，我会迟到的。当她事后想起来时，她突然想到，她应该对此感到惊讶。
But at the time it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket, But at the time it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket, and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet.
但当时这一切看起来都很自然，但当兔子真的从背心口袋里拿出一块手表时，看着它，然后又匆匆赶路，爱丽丝开始站起来。
For it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it.
因为她突然想到，她以前从未见过有背心口袋的兔子，或者从中取出一块手表，并充满好奇心，她追着它跑过田野。
And fortunately was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again.
幸运的是，我及时看到它从树篱下的一个大兔子洞里掉下来。又过了一会儿，爱丽丝追了上去，从来没有考虑过她到底要如何才能再次出去。
The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down a very deep well.
兔子洞像隧道一样笔直地延伸了一段路，然后突然下降，如此突然，爱丽丝还没来得及考虑停下来，就发现自己掉进了一口很深的井里。
Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her, and to wonder what was going to happen next. First, she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to.
要么这口井很深，或者她摔得很慢， 因为他有足够的时间下去环顾四周，想知道接下来会发生什么。第一的，他试图低头看看自己会看到什么。
But it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs.
但天太黑，什么也看不见。然后她看着井边，并注意到它们充满了橱柜和书架。她到处看到挂在钉子上的地图和图片。
She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labeled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody underneath.
她经过时，从一个架子上取下一个罐子，它的标签是橙子果酱，但令她非常失望的是，里面是空的。她不想把罐子扔掉，因为担心会杀死下面的人。
So managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll all think me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it.
当她跌倒时，她设法把它放进一个橱柜里。出色地，爱丽丝心里想，经历了这样的跌倒之后，我不会考虑从楼梯上摔下来。他们会认为我在家里是多么勇敢。为什么？我不会对此说什么。
Even if I fell off the top of the house, which was very likely true. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time. She said aloud, I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see.
即使我从房顶掉下来，这很可能是真的。向下，向下，向下。难道秋天永远不会结束吗？我想知道这次我已经跌倒了多少英里。他大声说道，我一定是要去地心附近的某个地方，让我看看。
That would be 4,000 miles down. I think, for, you see, Alice had learnt several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge,
那将是4000英里以下。我认为，对于你看，爱丽丝在教室里的课程中学到了一些类似的东西，虽然这不是一个展示她知识的好机会。
As there was no one to listen to her, still it was good practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance, but then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to. Alice had no idea what latitude was or longitude either.
因为没有人听她说话，再说一遍仍然是个好习惯。是的，这大约是正确的距离，但我想知道我需要什么纬度或经度。爱丽丝不知道纬度是什么或经度。
But thought they were nice grand words to say. Presently she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny ITLL seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downward. The antipathies, I think.
但我觉得这些话很好听。不久他又开始了，我想知道我是否会直接掉进地球。对于那些低着头走路的人来说，这看起来是多么有趣啊！反感，我认为。
She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word, but I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word, but I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? and she tried to curtsy as she spoke.
他很高兴没有人在听，这次因为这个词听起来根本不正确，但我得问他们这个国家的名字是什么。你知道请，我有，这是新西兰还是澳大利亚？他说话时试图行屈膝礼。
Fancy curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl shall think me for asking. No, ITLL never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down.
当你从空中坠落时，花式行屈膝礼，你认为你能做到吗？他会认为我是一个多么无知的小女孩。不，永远不会问。也许我会在某个地方看到它被写下来，向下，向下，向下。
There was nothing else to do, so Alice soon began talking again. Dinah'll miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was the cat. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me.
没有别的事可做，所以爱丽丝很快又开始说话了。戴娜今晚会非常想念我，我应该想。戴娜是那只猫，我希望他们会记得她下午茶时的一碟牛奶。戴娜，我亲爱的，我希望你在这儿陪着我。
There are no mice in the air, I'm afraid, but you might catch a bat, and that's very like a mouse, you know. But do cats eat bats, I wonder? And here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself, in a dreamy sort of way, do cats eat bats?
空气中没有老鼠，我担心，但你可能会抓到蝙蝠，这很像老鼠，你知道，但是猫吃蝙蝠吗？我想知道。说到这里，爱丽丝开始变得有些困了。然后继续对自己说，以一种梦幻般的方式，猫吃蝙蝠吗？
Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For, you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't much matter which way she put it. She felt that she was dozing off, and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah.
猫吃蝙蝠吗？有时蝙蝠吃猫吗？为了，你看，因为他无法回答任何一个问题，他怎么说并不重要。他感觉自己在打瞌睡，刚刚开始梦见他和戴娜手牵手走路。
And saying to her very earnestly, now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat? When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. And saying to her very earnestly, now, Dinah, tell me the truth. Did you ever eat a bat? When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not a bit hurt, and she jumped up onto her feet in a moment.
并非常认真地对他说：“现在，戴娜，告诉我真相，你吃过蝙蝠吗？”当突然，扑通扑通，他下来时发现了一堆树枝和干树叶。秋天结束了，爱丽丝没有受到一点伤害，她立刻跳了起来。
She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the white rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and was just in time to hear it say.
她抬起头，但头顶上一片漆黑，在她面前又是一段长长的段落，而白兔仍在视线之内，赶紧下来，一刻也不能耽搁。爱丽丝像风一样走了。正好听到他说
As it turned a corner, oh my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting. She was close behind it when she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. she found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. As it turned a corner, oh my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting. She was close behind it when she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen.
当他转弯时，我的耳朵和胡须已经很晚了。当他转过拐角时，他就紧随其后，但兔子已经不见踪影了。他发现自己陷入了漫长的困境中。迪厅被屋顶上悬挂的一排灯照亮。
There were doors all round the hall, but they were all locked, and when Alice had been all the way down one side and up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever to get out again.
大厅四周都有门，但它们都被锁了。当爱丽丝一直从一侧下降到另一侧时，尝试每扇门，她悲伤地走在中间，想知道她怎样才能再次出去。
Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it except a tiny golden key, and Alice's first thought was that it might belong to one of the doors of the hall, but alas, either the locks were too large.
突然她来到一张三腿小桌子前，全部由实心玻璃制成，上面除了一把小小的金钥匙之外，什么都没有。爱丽丝的第一个想法是它可能属于大厅的一扇门，但要么锁太大。
Or the key was too small, but at any rate it would not open any of them. However, on the second time round, she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high.
或者钥匙太小，但无论如何，她不会打开其中任何一个。然而，在第二轮，她发现了一个她以前没有注意到的低矮的窗帘，后面有一扇大约15英寸高的小门。
She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight it fitted. Alice opened the door and found that it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat hole.
她尝试用小金钥匙插进锁，令她非常高兴的是，它很适合。爱丽丝打开门，发现门通向一条小通道，比老鼠洞大不了多少。
She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains.
她跪下，沿着通道望向你所见过的最美丽的花园。她多么渴望离开那个黑暗的大厅，漫步在那些开满鲜花的花坛和凉爽的喷泉之间。
But she could not even get her head through the doorway, and even if my head would go through, thought poor Alice, it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope. I think I could.
但她甚至无法把头伸进门口，即使我的头会通过。可怜的爱丽丝想，如果没有我的肩膀，她就没有什么用处哦。我多么希望我能像望远镜一样闭嘴，我想我可以。
If I only knew how to begin. For, you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately, that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the little door.
如果我只知道如何开始，为了，你看，最近发生了很多不寻常的事情。爱丽丝开始认为很少有事情是真正不可能的，在小门旁等待似乎没有什么用处。
So she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key on it, or at any rate a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. This time she found a little bottle on it, which certainly was not here before, said Alice.
所以他回到了桌子旁，一半希望他能找到另一把钥匙，或者至少是一本像望远镜一样让人们闭嘴的规则书。这次他在上面发现了一个小瓶子，这以前肯定不在这里，爱丽丝说。
And round the neck of the bottle was a paper label with the words, "Drink me," beautifully printed on it in large letters. It was all very well to say, "Drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. No, I'll look first, she said.
瓶子的脖子上有一个纸标签，写着“喝我”，上面用大字精美地印着，说“喝我吧”，这一切都很好。但是聪明的小爱丽丝并不急于这么做。不，我先看看，她说。
And see whether it's marked poison or not, for she had read several nice little histories about children who had got burned and eaten up by wild beasts and other unpleasant things.
看看它是否被标记为有毒，因为她读过几本关于被烧伤的孩子的精彩小故事，被野兽和其他不愉快的东西吃掉。
All because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker. All because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife, it usually bleeds.
这一切都是因为他们不记得朋友教给他们的简单规则。例如，如果你拿着一根烧红的拨火棍太久，它会烧伤你；如果你用刀深深地割伤你的手指，通常会流血。
And she had never forgotten that, if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it is almost certain to disagree with you, sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice and she had never forgotten that, if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it is almost certain to disagree with you, sooner or later.
她从未忘记，如果你从标有毒药的瓶子里喝了很多，几乎肯定不同意你的观点，迟早。然而，这个瓶子没有标明毒药，于是爱丽丝就大胆地尝了尝，并发现它非常好，它有。
In fact, a sort of mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She very soon finished it off. What a curious feeling, said Alice. I must be shutting up like a telescope. And so it was indeed.
实际上，一种樱桃馅饼的混合味道，奶油冻、菠萝、烤火鸡、奶糖和热黄油吐司，它很快就完成了。多么奇怪的感觉！爱丽丝说：“我必须像望远镜一样闭嘴。”确实如此。
She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into that lovely garden. First, however,
她现在只有10英寸高，一想到她现在的身材已经适合穿过那扇小门进入那个可爱的花园，她的脸就放光了。第一的，然而
she waited for a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, you know, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then.
她等了几分钟，看看自己是否还要再缩小。她对此感到有点紧张，因为这可能会结束。你知道，爱丽丝自言自语道：“在我外出时，像蜡烛一样。我想知道那时的我应该是什么样子。”
And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. After a while, finding that nothing more happened, she decided on going into the garden at once, but
他试着想象蜡烛吹灭后的火焰是什么样子，因为他不记得曾经见过这样的东西。一段时间后，发现没有再发生任何事情，他决定立刻去花园里。但
alas for poor Alice! When she got to the door, she found she had forgotten the little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass.
可怜的爱丽丝啊！当她到门口时，她发现她忘记了那把小金钥匙。当她回到餐桌旁时，她发现她不可能够到它，她可以透过玻璃清楚地看到它。
And she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was too slippery, and when she had tired herself out with trying, the poor little thing sat down and cried. Come, there's no use in crying like that, said Alice to herself.
她竭尽全力爬上桌腿，但太滑了。当她尝试的精疲力尽时，可怜的小东西坐下来哭了来。这样哭是没有用的，爱丽丝自言自语道。
Rather sharply, I advise you to leave off this minute. She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it, and sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her eyes.
相当尖锐，我建议你暂时停止。她通常会给自己很好的建议，虽然她很少遵循，有时她严厉地责备自己，以致眼里含着泪水。
And once she remembered trying to box her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself, for this curious child was very fond of pretending to be two people, but it's no use now, thought poor Alice.
有一次，她记得自己在一场锤球游戏中欺骗了自己，试图打自己的耳朵，而她正在和自己比赛。因为这个好奇的孩子非常喜欢假装成两个人，但现在已经没有用了。可怜的爱丽丝想。
To pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me left to make one respectable person. Soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it and found in it a very small cake, on which the words eat and me.
假装成两个人，为什么？我的身体已经不足以成为一个受人尊敬的人了。很快，他的目光落在了桌子底下的一个小玻璃盒子上，他打开了它，并发现里面有一个很小的蛋糕，上面写着“吃我”。
Were beautifully marked in currants. Well, I'll eat it, said Alice, and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. So either way I'll get into the garden, and I don't care which happens.
被漂亮的标记在醋栗中出色的，我会吃它。爱丽丝说：“如果它让我变得更大，我能触及钥匙；如果它让我变小，我可以从门底下爬过去。所以无论如何，我都会进入花园。我不在乎发生什么。”
She ate a little bit and said anxiously to herself, "Which way? Which way?" holding her hand on the top of her head to feel which way it was growing, and she was quite surprised to find that she remained the same size. To be sure.
她吃了一点点，并焦急地对自己说：“哪条路？哪条路？”将手放在头顶上，感受它的生长方向。她很惊讶地发现自己的体型保持不变。当然
This generally happens when one eats cake, But Alice had got so much into the way of expecting nothing but out-of-the-way things to happen that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. So she set to work.
这通常发生在吃蛋糕时，但爱丽丝已经习惯了只期待一些奇怪的事情发生，生活以平常的方式继续下去，似乎是相当乏味和愚蠢的。于是她开始工作。
And very soon finished off the cake. Chapter 2. The pool of tears, curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. She was so much surprised that for the moment she quite forgot how to speak good English.
很快就吃完了蛋糕，第二张泪池越来越好奇。爱丽丝喊道，她非常惊讶，目前她完全忘记了如何说一口流利的英语。
Now I'm opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet. For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight. They were getting so far off. Oh, my poor little feet.
现在我像有史以来最大的望远镜一样打开。再见，脚。因为当他低头看着自己的脚时，他们似乎几乎看不见了，他们离得太远了。哦，我可怜的小脚。
I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears? I'm sure I shan't be able. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best way you can, but I must be kind to them, thought Alice.
我想知道现在谁会为你穿上鞋子和袜子，亲爱的，我确信我做不到，我会离你很远，无法为你烦恼，你必须尽力而为，但我必须善待他们，爱丽丝想。
Or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas. And she went on planning to herself how she would manage it. They must go by the carrier, she thought, and how funny it'll seem.
或许他们不会走我想要走的路，让我想想，每年圣诞节我都会给他们一双新靴子。他继续为自己计划如何处理这件事，他们必须通过承运人。他想，这看起来多么有趣。
Sending presents to one's own feet. And how the directions will look. Alice's right foot, esq, hearthrug, near the fender, with Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking. Just then her head sending presents to one's own feet. And how the directions will look. Alice's right foot, esq, hearthrug, near the fender, with Alice's love.
送礼物到自己脚下，方向看起来多么奇怪。爱丽丝的右脚，先生，如实靠近挡泥板，带着爱丽丝的爱，亲爱的，我在说什么废话？就在这时，他的头撞到了大厅的屋顶上。
In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice. It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look through into the garden with one eye.
事实上，她现在已经超过9英尺高了。她立刻拿起小金钥匙，快步向花园门口走去。可怜的爱丽丝，她已经尽力了，向一侧躺下，用一只眼睛看花园。
But to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, said Alice, a great girl like you. She might well say this, to go on crying in this way. But to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, said Alice. A great girl like you, she might well say this, to go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you.
但要渡过难关，比以往任何时候都更加绝望。他坐下来又开始哭泣。你应该为自己感到羞耻，爱丽丝说。像你这样的好女孩，她很可能会这么说。就这样哭下去，停止这一刻，我告诉你。
But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears, until there was a large pool all round her, about 4 inches deep and reaching half down the hall. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance.
但她还是继续流下数加仑的泪水，直到她的周围出现一个大水池，大约4英寸深，延伸到大厅的一半。过了一会儿，她听到远处传来轻微的脚步声。
And she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry.
他赶紧擦干眼睛，看看接下来会发生什么。原来是白兔回来了，穿着华丽，一手戴着白羊皮手套，一手拿着一把大扇子，小跑着走来。
Muttering to himself as he came, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess. Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Muttering to himself as he came, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess. Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask help of anyone. So, when the rabbit came near her, she began, in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir."
他来是自言自语：“哦，公爵夫人，公爵夫人，哦，如果我让他久等了，他会不会很野蛮？”爱丽丝感到非常绝望，她准备向任何人寻求帮助。所以，当兔子靠近她时，她开始再低、胆怯的声音：“如果你愿意的话，先生。”他来是自言自语：“哦，公爵夫人，公爵夫人，哦，如果我让他久等了，他会不会很野蛮？”爱丽丝感到非常绝望，她准备向任何人寻求帮助。所以，当兔子靠近她时，她开始再低、胆怯的声音：“如果你愿意的话，先生。”
The rabbit started violently, dropped the white kid gloves and the fan, and scurried away into the darkness as hard as he could go. Alice took up the fan and gloves, and as the hall was very hot, she kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking.
兔子开始猛烈的攻击，丢掉了白羊皮手套和风扇，然后拼命地逃进黑暗中。爱丽丝拿起扇子和手套，因为大厅里很热，她一边说话，一边不停地扇着扇子。
Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. And yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night? Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different.
亲爱的，亲爱的，今天的一切是多么奇怪！昨天一切都像往常一样进行。我想知道我是否在一夜之间改变了。让我想想，今天早上起床时的我是不是也是这样？我几乎想我记得感觉有点不同。
But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle. And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were of the same age as herself, to see if she could have been changed for any of them. I'm sure I'm not Ada.
但如果我不一样，下一个问题是，我到底是谁？这就是最大的谜题。 他开始思考他所认识的所有与他同龄的孩子，看看他是否可以为他们中的任何一个而改变。我确信我不是艾达。
She said, for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all. And I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and she knows such a very little. Besides, she's she, and am I, and oh dear, how puzzling it all is.
他说，因为他的头发卷得很长，我的根本不是小卷发。我确信我不能成为梅布尔，因为我知道各种各样的事情，和他，他知道的太少了。除了他就是他，我就是我，还有亲爱的，这一切是多么令人费解。
I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear. I shall never get to 20 at that rate. However, I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear. I shall never get to 20 at that rate. However, the multiplication table doesn't signify.
如果我知道我以前知道的所有事情，我会尝试让我想想，4乘5等于12，4乘6等于13，4乘7就是，天啊！以这个速度，我永远也到不了20岁。然而，乘法表并不表示。
Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome, and Rome. No, that's all wrong, I'm certain. I must have been changed for Mabel. I'll try and say, how doth the little.
我们来试试地理。伦敦是巴黎的首都，巴黎是罗马的首都，和罗马，不，这都是错误的。我确定，我一定是为了梅布尔而改变了。我会试着说这个小家伙怎么样。
And she crossed her hands on her lap as if she were saying lessons and began to repeat it, but her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come the same as they used to do. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail?
他双手交叉放在腿上，好像在讲课，并开始重复，但他的声音听起来沙哑而奇怪。这些话不再像以前那样了。小鳄鱼如何改进它闪亮的尾巴？
And pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale. How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcome little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. I'm sure those are not the right words, said poor Alice.
将尼罗河的水倒在每片金色的鳞片上，他笑得多么高兴，他的爪子张得多么整齐，用温柔的微笑迎接小鱼儿的到来。我确信这些词不正确，可怜的爱丽丝说。
And her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house, and have next to no toys to play with, and ever so many lessons to learn. And her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house, and have next to no toys to play with, and ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it, if I'm Mabel.
当他继续说下去时，他的眼睛里再次充满了泪水。毕竟我一定是梅布尔，我得搬去住在那个狭小的房子里，几乎没有玩具可玩。有这么多的教训要学习。不，我已经下定决心了。如果我是梅布尔
I'll stay down here. It'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, come up again, dear. I shall only look up and say, Who am I then? I'll stay down here. It'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, come up again, dear. I shall only look up and say, who am I then? Tell me that first, and then, if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else.
我会留在这里。他们低下头说：“再来吧，是没有用的，亲爱的。”我只会抬头说：“那我是谁？首先告诉我，劲儿。如果我喜欢成为那个人，我会出现；如果没有，我会留在这里，直到我成为别人。”
But, oh dear, cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears, I do wish they would put their heads down. I am so very tired of being all alone here. As she said this, she looked down at her hands.
但，亲爱的，爱丽丝喊道，突然泪流满面。我真希望他们能低下头，我厌倦了独自一人在这里。当她说这句话的时候，她低头看着自己的双手。
And was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white kid gloves while she was talking. How can I have done that? She thought. I must be growing small again. She got up and went to the table to measure herself by it, and found that.
惊讶地发现，她在说话的时候戴上了兔子的一只白色小羊皮手套。我怎么能这么做？她想，我一定又变小了。她起身走到桌子前，用它量自己，并发现
As nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high, and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether.
她能猜到的最接近的。它现在大约有2英尺高，并且还在迅速缩小。他很快发现，这是因为他手里拿着的扇子。他匆忙把它扔掉了，及时避免完全退缩。
That was a narrow escape, said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. That was a narrow escape, said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. And now for the garden. And she ran with all speed back to the little door. But, alas,
那是一次九死一生。爱丽丝说，对突然的变化感到非常害怕，但很高兴发现自己仍然存在。现在来说说花园，她全速跑回小门，但是，唉。